Hi, YouTube. My name is Jack. And today we're going to talk about why there are no Wicca books anymore. Um, this is a thing that you don't notice unless you are Wiccan and like actively looking for new books to read about Wicca. Because there's a dominant narrative. It's not entirely off base, but there's a dominant narrative that says the market of pagan and magical publishing is flooded with Wicca books, that everything is Wicca, that if you're not Wiccan, it's very hard to find things that aren't Wicca, and Wicca has this kind of hegemonic presence, and it's in everything. And there's kind of a sense in which that's true, but not for new publications, right? It is true that if you walk into a bookstore and you go to their self-improvement section, which is usually the section that has like one shelf of witchcraft books, the books that you are likely to see there are Scott Cunningham's Wicca: A Guide for the Solitary Practitioner, Raymond Buckland's Complete Book of Witchcraft, maybe A Witch's Bible by Janet and Stuart Farrer, and like maybe something by Silver Ravenwolf. Like those are the most likely books that you're going to see. And then there are probably a couple of more recent books, like you're probably going to see Psychic Witch on there. But like, yes, it is true that if you just walk into a bookstore, there's a very good chance that the books that you will see are going to be there's going to be a strong representation of Wicca on those shelves. But those books that I mentioned, with the exception of Psychic Witch, which is not a book about Wicca, those books are all more than 30 years old. And if you look at the landscape of current pagan publishing, there is almost nothing being published about Wicca, right? The most recent, like, Wicca 101 book that was published by a major publisher was, I think, Thea Saban's Wicca for Beginners, which is not recent at this point. And Deborah Lipp has a new book coming out. She has like a Wicca 101 that is releasing this year, I think. But that's kind of it. Like, that's it for introductory Wicca books. There is nothing recent. And if you go to Llewellyn or Weiser, if you go and look at their catalogs and you comb through new releases, if you go to the Wicca category and look at the books that they have published recently, there's nothing. There's absolutely nothing. I think if you go to the Llewellyn website, Kabbalah for Wiccans, which I published, what, like 4 or 5 years ago at this point? 5 years ago? That sounds right, 5 years ago. Like, that's still one of the most recent, I think it is the most recent book from Llewellyn that has Wicca in the title. And there are a couple of other books in the Wicca category on Llewellyn that have been published since then. None of them are really specifically about Wicca. Like, there's really nothing that has come out from Llewellyn in the past 5 years that is specifically targeted at Wiccan practitioners. And this is a thing that you don't notice if you're just kind of walking into a bookstore and seeing the books that they have and feeling frustrated that you can't find something about Wicca. But on the flip side, if you're following pagan publishers and trying to find things about Wicca, there is sort of a complementary frustration of there not being anything new that's coming out. And I think there are a couple of reasons for this. One, like the bookstore phenomenon, is just that bookstores tend to carry books that they know are going to sell. And the books that sell well are the sort of classics, right? The things that have been around for 30 years and have staying power. Those have a demonstrable track record. And like, yeah, if you keep a copy of Wicca: A Guide for the Solitary Practitioner in stock, someone's going to buy it, right? That's not necessarily true for like a brand new book that's just come out that's going to sell maybe 3,000 copies worldwide if they're lucky. And so just from a business perspective, a lot of bookstores are not are hesitant to take a risk with their stocking choices, because they don't want to stock something that they're not going to be able to sell. And here I'm thinking about kind of generalist bookstores, right? I'm thinking about the Barnes and Nobles of the world. It also kind of applies to like pagan and metaphysical shops specifically. Depending on the size of your shop and depending on your location, you are tailoring your selections to the clients that you have and to what they're going to buy. And you don't necessarily have the luxury of taking a risk and stocking something that looks kind of experimental and different. Even if it seems interesting to you, if people aren't going to buy it, you're not going to stock it. So, like, shops in large cities or shops in kind of famously witchy locations, places like Salem or New Orleans or, things like that, maybe have the luxury of trying for more diverse and experimental things. Diverse and experimental here, not referring to Wicca specifically, but just referring to like new books that are coming out that are untested and unproven. But most of the rest of like pagan shops that you find in whatever, like Toledo, you're gonna limit yourself because you are running a business at the end of the day, and you have to have things that people are going to buy. And if someone's going to walk in off the street, it's going to be a harder sell for you to be like, yes, here's this very niche book about, whatever, like fairy lore in Ireland in the 1700s, as opposed to like, here's an introductory book on witchcraft that's been around for 40 plus years, and lots of people have started out with it. It's tried and true. Like, here's a good place for you to start. So I think there's that phenomenon. But then there's also just there's this thing with like new Wicca books aren't being written. And unless you are in Wicca, unless you are sort of in that world and you're looking for the Wicca books, I don't think it's necessarily immediately apparent the extent to which new Wicca books are not being written, or at least not being published, right? Maybe they're being written. And there are a couple of reasons for that. One is just kind of globally, the trend in witchcraft is increasingly not Wicca. Right? There's increasingly a push for various types of folk magic, different forms of non-Wiccan witchcraft, often rooted in a particular sense of cultural or ethnic identity. Right, so there's a really big publishing trend right now with like Appalachian folk magic, or Alpine folk magic, or Polish folk magic, or Balkan folk magic, whatever it is. But like, there's a real trend in like regionally and culturally specific forms of historically attested folk magic that have then been developed into robust witchcraft practices by individual practitioners who are sharing their perspectives. That's what the market likes right now. And it's great. It's a wonderful thing. But I think that's the trend, and there's less interest in Wiccan publishing because of that. I don't mean to say that there's less interest in Wicca because of that, because I think the Wiccans are still around. But publishing, again, is a business. Publishing is its own world, and there are trends in publishing that affect what gets published and what gets bought. And right now, like, that's really the big trend. And there was a time in the 90s when Wicca was the trend in publishing, and it was so big, and you could not find a magical book that wasn't in some way calling itself Wicca. And I think that people remember that publishing boom of the 90s, and that sort of lingers and affects the perception that we sometimes have that like the market is dominated by Wicca books, because it used to be. It 100% used to be. And the thing that happened in the 90s is that everything had to be called Wicca, even if it wasn't. I'm on a Buffy rewatch right now. And the thing that you notice, not just with like pagan publishing, but with pop culture in the 90s, the word Wicca was just used as a synonym for witchcraft, right? Like, um, it, you see it in Buffy, you see it in Charmed. Like, the word Wicca is just used interchangeably with witchcraft, and it's not necessarily referring to, like, the particular kind of pagan religious witchcraft that we tend to think of as Wicca today. Like, it was just taken to be like that's the word for witchcraft, and and in Buffy there's also kind of this weird thing that they do sometimes where like they will use the word Wicca to refer to a practitioner. So there are various times where Willow is referred to as a Wicca, regardless. um, but so you got a lot of books that were published in the 90s that by today's standards we would really not say are about Wicca, but that called themselves Wicca, right? So you had like Italian Wicca books or whatever, and they got marketed as being Wicca books because the words Wicca and witchcraft were just being used interchangeably in the publishing space at that time. And I think that contributed to this idea that Wicca was everywhere. Wicca was so insidious and so pervasive, and you couldn't get away from it. Because there were a lot of things that really weren't Wicca, but that were being published as Wicca because that was what the publishing trend was at the time. And you actually see that. I think it's really fascinating to see. There are a lot of books that had gone out of print that are now being republished by Crossed Crow, which, if you don't know it, Crossed Crow is a relatively new pagan publisher. They've picked up a lot of out-of-print Llewellyn titles and republished them for modern audiences, usually with some kind of updating. They are going to be the ones publishing the second edition of Queen of All Witcheries, which I'm very excited about. I will do a video on that at some point once I have more details. But the thing that you see with a lot of the books that are being re-released from Crossed Crow is that they are books, in many cases, that were originally published with different titles, and with titles that made them sound like Wicca. And as they are being republished, one of the things that's happening a lot is the title is getting changed, and they are being marketed as something different, which in reality they kind of were all along. It's just that when they were published the first time around, the publisher kind of shoehorned Wicca into the title because that was what was selling at the time. So, like, I think there was this perception that everything was about Wicca in the 90s, even when it wasn't. And now we have, just a market demand for a lot of things that aren't Wicca, but B, we also have kind of this change in the publishing trend where not everything has to be sold as Wicca anymore, regardless of what it actually is. And I think it's also true that like market trends right now are really not driven by publishing houses the way that they used to be. Publishers used to really set the standard for what was popular and what people sought out in witchcraft, right? Publishers used to be able to kind of choose what they were going to sell, what they were going to market, and that would be what people bought and what people consumed. And the internet has changed that a lot. I think in particular, witch talk has changed things a lot. And there's a real thing that you see in pagan publishing spaces now, where a trend gets big on TikTok, and then the book publishers try to catch up. And you'll see a big TikTok trend, and then like a year or two later, there will be a couple of books that come out from major pagan publishers that are related to that trend from social media. And the big TikTok trends in the past, 5 years-ish? Has TikTok been around that long? I don't know. I'm an old man. Regardless, the big trends have not been Wicca specific, right? TikTok is not a predominantly Wiccan space when it comes to witchcraft and magical practice. And so I think we're seeing that as well in kind of what books are getting published and what the trends are in the book landscape, because it's coming from the internet. Anyways, all of this is just to say, like, I don't know, right? Like, there are lots of great books being published right now, and that's phenomenal, and I'm delighted to see such a wide scope of interesting things being written. There's very little being written about Wicca right now. And as someone who does Wicca and who really and truly doesn't do anything but Wicca. Like, my magical practice is Wicca and Wicca alone, and that's kind of the only thing I'm interested in. I will read things if I think that they can contribute meaningfully to my Wiccan practice or deepen my Wiccan practice. But like, that's who I am as a consumer. So I'm not actually like, and this is not a reflection on whether those books are good or should exist or anything like that. But like, I'm not actually that interested in learning about whatever, like the magical practices of the Pennsylvania Dutch and how to do hexerai, and like, I'm sure it's really cool. It's just, it's not my practice, and it's not what I'm looking for when I'm perusing books. So I find that the landscape of pagan publishing these days, while incredibly rich in many ways and providing a lot of content that hasn't been previously available, uh, is impoverished when it comes to books on Wicca, and that makes me kind of sad. Thank you for sticking around and watching. I will be back at some point soon. Catch you on the flip side.